All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Soren. I'm a senior at UW-Madison. And about a year ago, I had the project working in the UW Cart Lab of doing just a ton of maps for print publications that were a lot of small black and white maps for books and journals. And doing those maps, I had to make a lot of decisions that were based on what the client wanted and what the publishers wanted rather than what I did. I remember last year at NACIS, I was showing a couple of my maps to someone. They were like, why did you make those design decisions? And I realized I wasn't the one who made the design decisions. I was the one who has to work with other people's decisions to try to make the best map that I can. So here's a lot of the people we work with in the cartography world. And each of them have a different set of values and goals that they're trying to do and get across in the map. So it's important that us as designers can meet the goals of all these people and bring the whole project together. So one thing about clients that we often forget is they don't really have much cartographic experience. They might have been working on a project for a while, could be their life's work that they're very passionate about. So they can sometimes have a narrow vision of the project and how it works. But this is all very valid, and it's important that we are able to recognize the vision they have and make it come to life on the map. So publishers are often very concerned with cost. I know these days a lot of books that are out there are getting printed in black and white just because it's much cheaper. And this makes perfect sense. Again, we have to deal with the constraint of the publishers. Moving forward, editors in particular, maybe they're in charge of trying to get the map out on time. Again, a very important thing that has to happen. So for us to be able to meet that goal is important as a cartographer. So sometimes it can feel like it's hard to get to the design that we want with all this happening. But again, it's our job to meet all these very valid goals and make sure we can do it. So I'm going to go over some tricks that I've come up with making all of these maps in order to try to make the best map that I can while meeting all of these constraints. So we're going to go through a couple constraints and kind of show how I've worked around them to try to make the best map I can. So the first one is type. A lot of times we're having to work with someone else's brand. They want to use a specific typeface. That can get almost as narrow as a specific font. This past month I've been interning at City Lab, and for their brand, they only have one single font that they use. It's bold PF-DIN. So they can't buy other fonts, apparently. So it was my job to make that one single font work. Here's an example of what I did. Instead of using different fonts to distinguish between larger labels and smaller labels, I used the tracking, the opacity, and capitalization, which is something we often forget about. So here's an example. This is the exact same font. It's PF-DIN bold, but these two look very different. You can see we have Quebec tracked out over a larger period. It has a much more transparent view, whereas Montreal is using lowercase letters and is more condensed, is much bolder. So you can see how these two are completely distinguished using some interesting tricks rather than our classic, oh, let's make it bigger, or let's use a different font for something. So next, moving on to color. Obviously, a lot of publishers make us work in black and white, which is something that we have to deal with. And I've found that recently, rarely will a journal print in color. So I think black and white mapping is something in the web age that's kind of lost a lot of popularity. But I think it's important that we can learn how to design using this. So here's an example of, rather than using hue to call out features, we're using kind of a change in the visual hierarchy. We're using contrast to bring things out rather than highlighting with a certain color. So here's kind of the schema I tend to use when I'm making a black and white map, especially when it's small. As you can see, there's a big difference in all of the features, but there's changes. We don't just have steady ranks going up and up. It's less important in this map to show where is water and where is land, because that's what all maps show. This isn't necessarily a reference map. We bring it up a little bit with the contrast, showing the involved countries, just so we can see where people's eyes should be focused. But the big difference here is we have a 40% contrast in the actual data that's the main part of the map we want to show. That's what we want people's eyes to go to. We want them to see the point and line data, which is the point of the map, really. So we have the biggest contrast there. In this case, the type is also pretty important because we want people to read, so we also have a high contrast there. But you can see the differences in water and land. It's not a huge contrast, but we don't really care if people see that, the first thing. We want people to see the data. We want them to see the point of the map. So another solution we have using color is substituting for hue. This can be a little tricky. Here's a map that I use with a diverging color scheme in black and white at a very small scale or small print size. So a couple tricks that I use for that is the change of the background color, which you'll see in a second, but also using a subtle texture to imply that these areas are different. In this map, the areas that have the kind of hash texture show a decrease in population. The areas that have the darker texture, well, no texture at all, show an increase. So we really want to make sure that those two are very separate. So in this case, I'll show you how I did that. Here's your traditional divergent color scheme. You go from a white background and use blue and red. But when we don't have that option to be using blue and red, what we can do is we can set the background color to a 50% gray. And that way, when we go to black or we go to white, neither one of those is seen as more as the other, like in the map we were showing before, yet we can still get a good contrast. That's one of the ways that I've found that it works to show more of a nominal data scheme rather than an ordinal one in black and white. So in this situation, the white areas would be very different than the black areas. However, neither one of them is more important. So it's really important that we have to show those as separate, yet we want to make sure that neither one of them is considered more important in the visual hierarchy. The last one that I think everyone has to deal with is size. Obviously, we can't make a giant poster for every map, especially if it has to fit into a little book. So a couple books I've worked with set the size between 4 and 7 inches, something that's pretty small, but a lot of times you still have to fit a ton of labels on the map. So there's a couple tricks that I've learned in doing this, and a lot of this has to do with communication with the publisher, and also you can kind of condense the type a little bit. So a turn page is one of, I think, the most valuable tools in cartography, especially in books and journals. Because you can see here the difference, how much bigger we can make the map if it's just as simple as rotating the page. So if you're ever stuck there kind of communicating with the publisher and you're trying to think, oh God, how am I going to fit all these labels on the map? Maybe the solution isn't taking off labels or changing anything about the map, but it's changing the orientation of the page. There's a big difference here in the sizes of the map, and that's just as simple as asking the publisher, is it okay if we rotate the page on the side? Lastly, this is a trick I like to do that isn't always perfect, but if you're in a real bind, it can help. The top, we have our normal text, and on the bottom here, we've set the tracking to -50. So as you can see, this isn't quite as readable, but it's still pretty readable, and it shortens the type down a lot. So those are a couple tricks that I've used to maximize my creative control while I'm designing small maps. So thank you.